Welcome to the book of Galatians, Paul's most aggressive letter in which he is just laying into the church for giving into a false teaching which he says undermines the gospel itself. I mean, are we saved by grace or by our own works? And that's the question that Paul is asking in the letter of Galatians. But before we get into that, let's do a little background. So, when did Paul write this letter and to whom? Well, first off, Galatia is not a city, it is a region, the region to which Paul ministered on his first missionary journey. Let's take a look at that journey. So, here's a map I hope you're becoming familiar with of Paul's first missionary journey. He departed from Antioch with Barnabas, went to Barnabas's hometown here in Cyprus, and then got back on the main land here of Asia Minor and went through Antioch and Pisidia, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. And these are the main cities, the region of Galatia, to which Paul is writing this letter. And when Paul, after he runs through all these cities and preaches the gospel, when he returns to Antioch, that is when he writes the letter to Galatians. He writes his letter of Galatians. And importantly, he writes that letter before, or probably very soon before, the Jerusalem Council. And when he gets back to Antioch, before the Jerusalem Council happens, there are some Jews who have converted to Christianity who leave Jerusalem and go up to Antioch. And look what they say here. So Paul and Barnabas get back to Antioch, tell Antioch all about their first missionary journey, but some men, they come from Judea, and they're teaching the brothers, these are both Jews and Gentiles in Antioch, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. And this is the same problem that Paul is dealing with in his letter to Galatians. These are probably the same men who have left Judea and went to Galatia and are preaching circumcision. Now, the council is going to meet in Jerusalem to discuss this matter. Do Gentiles need to keep the law? Let's look at that. Back to the book of Acts. There are members of the party of the Pharisees. They're saying you got to be circumcised and keep the law of Moses, you Gentiles. So the elders and the apostles are going to gather together and discuss this, and they will decide, no, Gentiles do not need to keep the law on the basis of our personal experience, Peter and Paul, and also on the basis of Scripture itself. They decide that we should not trouble the Gentiles by forcing them to keep the law of Moses. And this word trouble, it's a pretty important word. This is their decision, and they communicate that decision via a letter to the Gentile believers. And in this letter, they say, now we have heard that some people have gone out from us. Some Jewish believers left Judea and went into the wide world of the Greeks, and they are troubling you with words, unsettling your mind. And see this word trouble, tarazo, they are troubling you. And this verse, you guys, is our entry point into understanding the book of Galatians. These persons that went out are the same persons that went to Galatia and are preaching to these Galatians a different message, a different gospel. And let me show you. Let me make that point for you. These troubling false Judaizing missionaries. Let's go to Galatians 1, where Paul says, I'm astonished that you're deserting him who called you and turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another one, but that there are some who would trouble you, tarazo, and they desire to distort the gospel of Christ. Tarazo, there's some troubling people here in Galatia. And then in Galatians 5, I have confidence in the Lord that you will take no other view, no other gospel than the one, and that the one who is troubling you, tarazo, will bear the penalty, whoever he is. So um, these missionaries, these false missionaries who are preaching the circumcision, who are coming from Judea, we call them Judaizers. We call them Judaizers because they are teaching that the Gentiles must become Jewish before they can become Christians. They want to Jewishize the Gentiles, Judaize them. And we know that the first step to becoming Jewish is to be circumcised. And let me show you that in the text, and it's really located here in the conclusion of the book of Galatians. Let me show you. Galatians 6. I'll scroll down a little bit here, especially in verses 12 and 13. These Judaizers, it says that they desire to have you circumcised. They would force you to be circumcised. And here in these two verses, in the conclusion of Galatians, we're given the motives. Why do these guys go to so much trouble to preach the circumcision? What's their motive? And Paul says they've got two motives, these Judaizers. They want to boast in your flesh, Gentiles, and they want to avoid persecution. Let me show you that in those two verses, Galatians 6, 12 and 13. They desire to have you circumcised that they may boast in your flesh. They want to make a good showing in the flesh. And what does that mean? Probably they just want to boast about how many converts they've made. They have the same spirit as the Pharisees when Jesus condemned the Pharisees, saying, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you travel across land and sea to make a single convert, and then that convert becomes twice as much of the son of the devil as you are." They want to boast in the flesh. But Paul says, "Far be it from me to boast in anything except for the cross of Christ." I don't boast in the flesh, I boast in the cross. Now, the Judaizers' second motive for preaching the circumcision is to avoid persecution. And let me ask you for a minute, was Paul persecuted as a missionary? And where was he, or where did that persecution come from? Who were his most aggressive persecutors? Well, on Paul's first missionary journey alone, in the region of Galatia, in Antioch and Pisidia, he was driven out of the city by the Jews. In Iconium, he was driven out of that city by the Jews. And then he went to Lystra, where he was stoned and left for dead, again, by the Jews. So Paul's going to ask a question, man, why am I being persecuted for my message? Let's look at that. So these Judaizers, it says that they would force you to be circumcised because they are in order that they may not be persecuted for the cross of Christ. But come up to chapter 5, where Paul says, he asks, why am I being persecuted? If I preach the circumcision like the Judaizers, well, then the offense of the cross would be removed. So what is Paul saying here? What does he mean by this? He's saying that as a missionary, if I'm going to these Gentile regions and preaching, if my message is become Jewish, well, then the Jews, they've got no problem with that. If my message is be Jewish, they're not going to persecute me for that. But that is not Paul's message. His gospel is that we are saved by grace through faith apart from the works of the law. And there's quite a few Jews out there who are not in favor of that message. But let's take a step back here for a minute and ask, man, what's the big deal with the law? I mean, God is the one who came up with the law in the first place, right? Why shouldn't the Gentiles keep the law? Well, I want to turn to Paul's strongest statement in Galatians 5 about that question, Gentiles and the law. Look at this. Here in Galatians 5, Paul says, look, I, Paul, say this to you. If you accept circumcision, Christ will be of no advantage to you. You will be severed from Christ, as a matter of fact. You will fall away from grace. You see, for Paul, this is a salvation issue. If you are trying to obtain justification by your own works, the works of the law, you're severed from Christ and the work that he did for you on your behalf. As a matter of fact, he's going to call this a different gospel. Justification not by faith, but by works. And let's look at that introduction, verses 6 to 9 in chapter 1. It's so critical for the book of Galatians. Back up to chapter 1. I am astonished, Paul says, that you're so quickly turning away from him who called you and are turning to a different gospel. And those who would trouble you, they want to distort the gospel. But then he says, man, if we or an angel from heaven were to preach to you a gospel contrary to the one that we preached to you, justification by faith, let that person be accursed, Paul says. He's going to repeat that curse. So how does Paul, well, let's see. What is this different gospel? Justification by works. He's going to make that point in one verse 3 times. This, you might even call this the thesis of the book of Galatians. Here in chapter 2, verse 16, he's going to repeat it 3 times. Look at this. Yet we know that a person is, go away, BDAG. We know that a person is not justified by the works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. Boom. 1. So we have believed in Christ in order that we may be justified by faith and not by the works of the law. 2. For by the works of the law, 3, no one will be justified. So that's Paul's thesis. That's his message in the book of Galatians. How is he going to prove that point? How is he going to refute these false teachers and their false gospel? Well, if this letter was written after the Jerusalem Council took place, it would be easy. Paul would just have to get out his pen and say, the apostles decided it, it's settled, there you go. They said Gentiles don't have to keep the law of Moses. Done. But in God's providence, he arranged that Paul would write this letter before the Jerusalem Council in order that we would be given a careful and thoughtful exposition of the relationship between the law and the gospel, and a vigorous defense of salvation by grace through faith apart from the works of the law. So how does Paul craft this defense? What is the structure of the book of Galatians? Well, three big sections, 3 arguments. The first argument in 111 to 221 is an argument about the origin of Paul's gospel. And he's going to provide a quick bibliography, a quick biography in order to prove that his gospel is not man's gospel. He did not make it up, but he received it from revelation or by revelation from Jesus himself. And then in this second argument, an argument by redemptive history in 3:11 to 5:15, actually that would be 3:1, not 3:11. There we go. 3:1 to 5:15, Paul is going to argue that his gospel, justification by faith, was actually preached to Abraham long before the law came by Moses, and that while the law served its purpose in its own place in redemptive history, that law was actually kind of a form of slavery. And now that Jesus Christ and faith in Jesus Christ has come, we are not slaves, but we are free in the new covenant spirit. And Paul's third argument is an argument based on results. You see, the law could never conquer the flesh or our sinful nature, but the Spirit can. And through the new covenant Spirit, we can experience victory in our battle against sin. And in our following lectures, we're going to take a closer look at each of these 3 arguments that Paul marshals against this false gospel of justification by works.